So thank you very much for these really, really rich and interesting, but also very diverse papers. Each of you approached very sensitively and interestingly your case studies, but also introduced very interesting methodological and formal questions and theories, which I think are useful across all of these papers. So I wondered first whether anybody would like to respond to whether any of you would like to respond to any of the other papers. You know, personally, I of course found Katalin Cseh's really, really rich presentation about the networks. So, but I would like you to respond to one another if you would like to.
Question for Tomas. Tomas, you used the term alternative official. Was it? My question is about this term you use. Whether this is something you exclusively call the practice of Kvěkulik, or you could find such a positions further in Poland or in, let's say, former Eastern Europe, and how if you could more tell about this term, how you understand it. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the question. The term is my own invention, if I can call it like that. It came out of a problem that I had with this official versus unofficial opposition. Because what is unofficial, especially in Poland of the 1970s? What can you really call unofficial, like unofficial space, gallery, etc., etc.? And how would you define unofficial? So instead of trying to define it, okay, and find places that would be really unofficial, probably what Kvěkulik were doing in their apartment was unofficial if you try to define unofficial by saying that it is not formalized. It has no formal status in terms of being registered somewhere, etc., etc. So probably this is one way of defining it. And what they wanted to do, what they were applying for with their different projects, was to create an institution that would be accustomed to the specificity of the process-based art. So they wanted to introduce some other institutions, not the traditional ones that there were at the moment. They were trying to propose a different institution. Okay, so this is what I wanted to call alternative official, and probably you can find some other similar proposals, and the activity of many neo-avant-garde galleries that were in a way official or semi-official could also be called in a similar fashion. Okay, they wanted to propose different ways of proceeding with art production, documentation, and propagation also. So I guess the term could be used as a kind of general concept for very many different, not only in Poland, activities and practices. So this would be more or less the answer.
To the specific period, and also why
it works quite well with the context of Poland of the 1970s, and this is what I can say. But I guess you could also try to apply it to other decades and other after 90s. Okay, the institutions, let's take the Polish example. Okay, so after the turn of 1989, some people who were previously connected to this unofficial or semi-official art scene, they became directors of official institutions. Wojciech Krukowski, whose name I evoked, was one such example. And what they were trying to do was to introduce the alternative ideas, thinking into official institutions. So it's kind of more difficult then, I guess, because the alternative really becomes the official then. Okay, so I'm not sure about the 90s. Probably if you kind of try to apply this term to like new spaces that are born in the 90s and later, probably we should kind of modify it or change it or specify it. But you know, it's an open idea and it could be tested with different cases.
Thank you. I think Zdenka should be allowed to have a word about this.
I miss a little bit political dimension in this. So how would you relate it to dissident art or activities?
I didn't want to.
Why?
Because I think generally what we've been doing, I mean art historians from the region for 3 decades now, was more or less to work on this kind of dissident, more or less explicitly. Art, either political dissidence or artistic dissidence in terms of doing experimental art. And it's okay, I'm not against it. I just think that even this kind of experimental tendencies should be inserted back into this more official context, which is, again, the case of Poland, but I guess also Yugoslavia would be a good example. And in the case of Kvěkulik, who have also been described as kind of dissident in artistic terms, at least, I wanted to reinsert them into this official context to which they kind of were trying to enter, really. They did not succeed, or they were not quite successful in it, but this is what they wanted to work into. So I don't think they wanted to be dissidents in the 70s. They wanted to be official and yet to do their experimental art. And they wanted the authorities to accept their experimental approach.
Would you like to say or to find more like comparative moments to make it less specific and more general? Don't you think this is a little bit dangerous also?
Yeah, I know what you're alluding at. Still, I think that doing this, I wouldn't call it national, but local histories is important, because without this kind of in-depth research, we don't get like material for comparisons. So this is what I'm trying to do with Kvěkulik. But I'm also thinking about comparisons, and the comparisons between the 1970s Poland and Yugoslavia is like an obvious one. I think that the question of student centers, for example, might be one kind of comparative platform. And I'm not sure, I haven't started really my research into that, but yes, I think that some comparisons would be welcome here.
Yes, just to maybe draw a comparison here. I think that the term semi-official can be kind of productive in a lot of senses, especially also for the Hungarian case in the late 60s and the 70s, because of course there is a difference between what you understand as political, and another thing is what you understand as dissident, as a sort of a historical narrative, let's say, which is imposed on these artists. But semi-official, in a sense, at least to me, is productive, because it shows that there was not really an outside of the system that was thoroughly politicized. And for instance, if the example of the cultural centers and the clubs comes up in the Hungarian case too, they pointed the art that was produced, exhibited there, that point into a more experimental direction, but at the same time they were part of a certain structure, also a political and bureaucratic structure. So I think that this can be interesting to analyze from comparative point of views.
Can I quickly just say something? That I think that Kvěkulik practice cannot be a model in a way, because they literally explicitly work with this idea of entering the system and being alternative official. This is this grounded research. You basically have the terminology that in a way comes from their practice. It was potential history, but you cannot use the same and include another practices which weren't dealing with this topic explicitly.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the floor? Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Daniel. Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. I wasn't familiar with this white space and white space installation at the Dům umění, and maybe inspired by Lina's talk earlier this morning, it made me think of Zorka Saglova, who has white sheets in a very not white space of just a few years earlier. So I was wondering, in Sudomierz in Bohemia in an open-air landscape. So I was wondering if you had thought about, or if you know, if there was any sort of conversation or relationship between these two pieces, even if it was potentially a rebuke of her piece, or if there are any like concrete comparisons to be made there. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think this opens definitely the gender perspective here, and I think also not only Zorka Saglova, I would maybe mention Romanian artist Ana Lupaș, who worked with white canvases in the countryside. So there are more artists that could be compared with white space in white space. I think that they knew each other, and I think they even met, but I'm not sure about specific talks or inspirations there. So I think that this would be more a kind of speculation if we do not find a kind of document or proof. And the other thing is that white space in white space really developed in a very closed circle of artists, and it was not known to the colleagues until they published and circulated the manifesto. So I think there was very little discussion at the beginning, and I did not have time or managed my time badly to do further to track the further stages that were shown in Poland and Yugoslavia, specifically in Belgrade. So and later there are the project really expanded also in terms of creating the further stages of it. So it was almost the whole decade that it took, and the archive of this white space in white space is basically divided into 3 artists, and of course the most I was talking about Stanofilko because he kind of appropriated the whole project, because Jan Załuski was a scenographer, and he in the late 70s he stepped out and gave the permission to Stanofilko to work further with it. So I think it's very complex, and also in terms of authorship, Stanofilko was later kind of aware of the fact that it's not his own work, though he integrated it into his own self-interpretational and system of his own thinking. So this is interesting also in terms of self-archiving, how he later rewrote the whole story, and there is this discrepancy between what happened really in the 70s and how he actually recomposed the whole thing later.
Question for Karolina. Maybe I missed it, but could you say something about the material infrastructure behind the Valley Expert Archive? I mean, where is it hosted and who finances it? And also, if you can say something about the uses of it, which I think you mentioned, but you didn't go into, like what kind of projects happened?
I think it was a bit unfair that at the end I didn't speak enough about the Valley Expert Research Center. So it's an institution which was launched in collaboration between municipal institutions, so Lentos Museum and Arts Academy in Linz, and we have actually here the managing director of the institution, Dagmar Schink, who is present here. Hello. And it's the director of the institution, Sabine Folly, who curated several exhibitions and which problematize the archive as a place of research, and also they were, like, let's say, in a performative way, created a concept for the whole archive. And activities of the institution, you could really say that one way is to present material in this curated way, so there are exhibitions and in external institutions, small exhibitions that take place within the institutions. Every 3 months there is a collections of glimpses. It's like a series which represents artists as different kind of cultural producers. So it's Valley Export as a filmmaker, Valley Export as a teacher, and so on and so on. So you have these glimpses. So they are these curated channels, but you also can access the institution and conduct your own research. There are 2 ways. There are fellowships, which this institution provides for PhD students, but you also can, as a researcher, access the material and work and produce knowledge. And this is how there are also conferences like this one, which they are organized, but they are open for accessing and getting what you want.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to drink our coffee much faster tomorrow, okay? If we're going to get more conversation time, because our speakers have kept to time. It's really our fault that we have not enough time, because you were all very, very punctual. So thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing in the morning.